I'm Peter Jenkins. I'm chairman of British Pugwash. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to chair this meeting. I'm going to hand that over to James Brady, a member of our committee who's kindly agreed to chair. Before doing that, though, I did just want to underline how fortunate and how privileged we are to have Dr. Blix speaking to us this afternoon. In my view, he is a great man in an age where great men have become thin on the ground. He was at the helm of the International Atomic Energy Agency, a jewel of the international order for 16 years, and those 16 years were exemplary. And as many of you remember, no doubt, in 2003, he had the courage and the convictions to speak truth to a misguided and deceitful hegemonic power, for which he will forever have my highest admiration. I could say a lot more, but as time is short, I will hand over now to James.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to everyone who has joined us for today's event. My name is James Brady, and I'm a committee member of British Pugwash, the organisation which seeks to provide a forum for scientifically informed discussion on nuclear weapons and a range of other risks to humanity. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Hans Blix. Dr. Blix has had a distinguished and eminent career in the field of disarmament and non-proliferation. From 1978 to 1979, Dr. Blix served as the Foreign Minister of Sweden. From 1981 to 1997, he served as the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And from 2000 to 2003, he served as head of the United Nations Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission for Iraq. And we are absolutely delighted that you could join us today, Dr. Blix. He joins us today to discuss the central thesis of his recent publication, A Farewell to Wars, The Growing Restraints on the Interstate Use of Force, published by Cambridge University Press. And the format for today's event is as follows. We'll present first Dr. Blix's presentation, which he has kindly recorded specially for today's session. And following that, Dr. Blix is joining us for a discussion which will follow. We aim to run today's event for an hour and 10 minutes. And I would kindly ask all participants, for those of you who are joining us today, please check your microphone is muted at this point. At this point, Tim, if we could please go ahead with Dr. Blix's presentation at this point, that would be wonderful. And following that, we'll move to the discussion. Thank you.
I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak online with fellow members of Pugwash. I'll explain some of the ideas I've presented in my book, A Farewell to War, which has the explanatory subtitle, The Growing Restraints on the Interstate Use of Force. I can understand that at a time when Russia's war against Ukraine dominates the news, the title of the book has made some shake their heads and cite a Swedish saying that, and I quote, when the devil gets old, he becomes religious. Well, I am as indignant as others are about the Russian brutality and aggression in Ukraine. I'm also concerned about the erosion that the action brings to the legal order laid down in the UN Charter. I disagree with those who casually say that there have always been wars and there always will be wars. The comment ignores that the world has changed, that its legal order has developed, and that war with nuclear weapons may threaten our existence. I've wanted to assess how, in this modern world, incentives and restraints to the interstate use of force have changed. I'm not talking at all about civil wars, it's all about interstate wars. My study, I'm glad to report to you, finds that several long-term trends point to a world with less of traditional warfare, more of cooperation, and a switch to interstate competition by other means than the use of armed force. One factor contributing to these trends has been what I would term the public mind, including global awareness of what the Russell-Einstein Manifesto calls the perils of the development of weapons of mass destruction. I shall return later to the role of the public mind, and I shall also explain why I don't think that the Russia special military operation, as it has been called, in Ukraine will break the long-term trend away from traditional kinetic warfare. I begin my study by noting that the geographic areas of the world in which interstate armed conflicts currently are going on are linked mainly to Ukraine and the Middle East. North America and South American states have long ago said farewell to interstate war. In Africa, colonialism was in some cases ended by wars of national liberation, and there are many armed internal conflicts in Africa, but there are remarkably few interstate conflicts. In Asia, apart from the major conflicts fought in Korea and Vietnam, lesser wars have erupted involving India and Pakistan, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia. There was also a brief armed conflict between China and Russia. In Europe, remarkably, after millennia of war, the states have united in a union for peace and cooperation. Equally remarkable, the breakup of the Soviet Union resulted in a peaceful liberation of European states and a peaceful emancipation of many states in Central Asia. The Russian war on Ukraine and the armed struggle between Armenia and Azerbaijan have been exceptions to this peaceful devolution. To this geographic overview, I should add that we have had now 80 years without World War, while only 20 years passed between World War I and II. The League of Nations existed for only 20 years, while the United Nations has now been in operation for 80 years. It remains the primary world forum and an instrument for peace when the participating musicians are ready to use it. The Russell-Einstein Manifesto was not written to register peaceful areas of the world geography, but to warn of the novel, immense threats. It states that the primary tasks are, first, the renunciation of war and the finding peaceful means for the settlement of disputes. It notes that it is illusory to think that war may be allowed to continue provided modern weapons are prohibited. Yes, yet, it says, to abolish war is difficult, and it urges the renunciation of nuclear weapons as part of the general reduction of armaments as a first step. This demand, that is easy for all to understand, has helped to forge and sustain a strong world opinion. It has helped to generate valuable agreements on arms control, and we should recognize that it has been vital to help maintain 80 years of non-use of nuclear weapons. My book notes the importance that the public mind has had, for instance, for the abolition of slavery, for decolonization, for human rights, for the prohibition of torture, and the abolition of the death penalty. It stresses the continued importance of public opinion for nuclear disarmament and for the fundamental demands demand that armed force shall not be used in interstate relations. More specifically, the book seeks to identify incentives existing today for the interstate use of armed force, disincentives and alternatives today to the use of armed force. Thus, I describe how traditional strivings for regional or global hegemony may generate incentives for the interstate use of armed force. I also note that some new risks may create incentives to the use of interstate use of force, such as terrorism, competition in space, and potential further spread of nuclear weapons, as in the case today of the US threat of bombing Iran. I note, on the other hand, that some incentives to the interstate use of armed force have disappeared or will not materialize. With the dismantling of colonialism, there are no incentives anymore for wars of liberation, unless we see the Palestinian struggle as such a war. With monarchies disappearing, there are no incentives for wars of succession. Religion remains powerful forces, but no religious bloc of states will embark on world jihads. Increased coherence is predicted between Russia, China, and the South, but it is unlikely to cause an armed clash of civilizations. The conquest of land is no longer seen as glorious and as creating incentives to war. The occupation of Crimea and the Ukraine and the threat against Taiwan have not been caused primarily by hunger for land, but by hurt pride. The major part of my book seeks to identify disincentives that now exist to the resort to armed force between states. The first disincentive is the possible cost in lives and property and the risk of defeat. It is therefore understandable that military strength, deterrence, is the primary means that states employ to create disincentives to the use of force against themselves. Before discussing deterrence, however, I shall focus on two other factors designed or likely to be disincentives. One factor is the legal norms and institutions. In our national communities, our states, citizens are told by rather precise laws what they are prohibited to do. For instance, not to use force against their neighbors. For the most part, the added threats of penalties for violations are not needed. The legal rules are respected without threats of sanctions, as they reflect long existing social norms. In the community of states, on the other hand, the situation is different. From time immemorial, communities have felt no social norm demanding of them to refrain from using force against each other. War was legal. It was not until the adoption of the Covenant of the League of Nations in 1920 that an agreed written prohibition of the interstate use of force came into being. It was confirmed and amplified in the UN Charter in 1945, and international criminal law has added personal responsibility. This is a tremendous evolution, and the public mind has been an essential factor in bringing it about. We know, of course, that the Security Council is not an effective mechanism for condemning violations and taking enforcement action. Yet, I submit there is value already in the world community-defined prohibition of the interstate threat of use of force. It is known by all, and it may, together with condemnations of violations by the General Assembly or Security Council, create reactions in the world community. Violations affect the reputation and standing of violators. The rule forms by itself a certain, admittedly insufficient disincentive to violations. Another factor is the accelerating interdependence of states. Globalization adds important disincentives to any interstate use of force. Great dividends are derived from more interstate trade, communication, and division of labor. Ripping apart profitable cooperation and trade through the use of force of war is costly and painful. Now I return to military deterrence. I believe with Darwinists that one reason why our species of man turned out to be the fittest to survive and thrive has been that among our genes were some that made us ready to use force to grab and defend resources and territory for surviving and living. Smart for survival was and is also to refrain from the use of force when there is certainty or high risk of defeat, perhaps loss of life and freedom. The conclusion that we find self-evident follows that while diplomacy and mediation have always been available to avert conflict, a principal way to prevent attacks has always been to deter by showing superior or at least significant force. It works at all levels of development. In the past, clans discouraged acts of violence against their members by threatening collective revenge. Today, great powers publish nuclear posture reviews that warn which actions may trigger them to use their nuclear weapons. This may be an effective deterrent. However, between states that have a second strike nuclear capacity, nuclear deterrence is more complicated. The Cuban crisis in 1962 made the US and the Soviet Union painfully aware that the use of nuclear weapons by either could trigger a second strike and a nuclear Armageddon. This awareness led President Kennedy and the Soviet leadership to negotiations that resulted in the Soviet naval and nuclear withdrawal from Cuba. American commitment to withdraw missiles from Turkey allowed Chairman Khrushchev to retreat from his reckless adventure without completely losing face. The mutual possession of a second strike nuclear capacity and the awareness that its use could lead to what is termed mutually assured destruction was a key factor and led to diplomacy. Ever since the Cuban affair, the US has sought to create immunity against nuclear attacks, including the risk of second strike. Billions of dollars have been and are still being spent on missile defense, Star Wars, now termed Global Golden Dome. Yet these efforts have failed, and the risk of a mutually assured destruction in a nuclear war remains. So does the conclusion that has been drawn that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. Yet, despite this oft-repeated and welcome affirmation, the risk remains that they can be used, so long as any nuclear weapons remain. In my view, this risk is leading to restraints in nuclear weapon states to embark upon or allow themselves to be drawn into any conflicts that may, through escalation or spread, become nuclear. Uncertainty about how new methods of warfare like cyber, space, artificial intelligence, and autonomous weapons may impact probably strengthens this restraint. The restraint, if real, is welcome and should naturally comprise the eschewing of all nuclear brinkmanship play. It should logically be supplemented by a reduction of the stocks of nuclear weapons. If I'm right in believing that restraints arise on embarking on or joining traditional armed conflicts due to concerns about the risk of horizontal or vertical nuclear escalation, a significant question arises, namely, how, if not by kinetic force, will the competition be pursued and the underlying conflict be solved? Now, the good answer should naturally be by diplomacy. but I think it is likely that hybrid war measures will be used or threatened to back the diplomacy. The signs I humbly, some of you may say naively, suggest already point to an ongoing switch to a hybrid non-kinetic war, notably between the major blocs of states. I'm tempted here, citing a quote I recently saw from George Orwell. In 1945, George Orwell wrote, and I quote, "The atomic bomb is likely to put an end to large-scale wars, and at the cost of prolonging indefinitely a peace that is no peace." Unquote. Currently, we can follow the wrestling that is taking place on the economic and financial battlefields, economic sanctions and blockades. Even if not lethal, these forms of contest may cause great pain and pressure. There is further an increasing use of cyber to disturb important and indispensable industrial and social services. Supply of electricity or water may be sabotaged, air traffic disturbed, cables under the sea and pipelines for oil and gas can be damaged. We have seen operations to impact on elections, support of political parties, toppling of governments through coups. With such measures, as I'm inclined to think, will they be replacing, or will they merely add to kinetic warfare? The influence of public opinion is an increasingly important part of the competition between blocs. We see a kind of beauty contest in which one side paints Western liberal political and political cultural patterns as decadent and perverse, and the other side criticizes Russia and China, their political systems, as inhumane, authoritarian, indifferent to the rule of law. Even such matters as which system has been superior in space, exploits, or poorest in combat is the poorest in combating COVID-19 are evoked in the world competition about public opinion. The activities span from generally accepted open ways of influencing opinion to subversive, deniable actions, engineered insurrections, and political murders. They are conducted by other agents than men in uniform. Some of the practices were pursued by both sides already during the Cold War. I would suggest that although the US and Western countries have agencies like CIA that are skilled in and practice subversion, the Russian model of deep state is exceptionally well adapted to hybrid warfare. It has been formed over a long time by large, partly underground agencies like the Cheka, and later the KGB, and now the FSB. The development and pursuit of different forms of hybrid warfare will raise the need for supplementing the laws of war by international rules on what is accepted as legitimate competition and what is branded as impermissible intervention. Such rules can emerge through state practice, judgments of the UN and the International Court of Justice. There seems to be broad agreement that the laws of war apply to cyber conflict, and the US has even indicated that nuclear weapons could be used in retaliation for cyber attacks of a gravity comparable to that prohibited weapons of mass destruction. I will now conclude, firstly by some comments on the Russian aggression in Ukraine, then with some reflections on the role of diplomacy to forestall and prevent the interstate use of force. Let me recall that during the Cold War, the West established NATO as a part of a policy of containment of what it saw as an attempted Soviet communist expansion in Europe. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, we have seen the play in reverse. Russia has sought to pursue a policy to contain Western NATO expansion. The NATO decision in Bucharest in 2008 that Georgia and Ukraine were to become NATO members marked the failure failure of Russia's efforts in the rules of diplomacy. The decision contributed, I believe, to trigger the Russian intervention in Georgia. And some years later, Ukraine's economic and political drift to the European Union, but above all, the prospect of Ukrainian integration into NATO and the possible stationing of NATO forces on Russia's doorsteps generated the incentive to occupy the Crimea in 2014 and to invade Ukraine in 2022. In my view, the invasion in February 2022 was not intended to be a full-scale war, but rather a Crimea #2, a smart special military operation that would quickly topple a regime that was deemed by Moscow to be unrepresentative and in power through Western-supported coup. The operation failed as it was based on erroneous intelligence and a lack of understanding that the majority of Ukrainians wanted independence and emancipation from Russia and from an increasingly unattractive economic and political system. I see the Russian action as a disastrous aberration and a deviation from, but not an end to the long-term evolution from interstate war. Now about diplomacy. I find it depressing that states spend billions on intricate military planning to deter possible adversaries from conceivable armed actions, and so little effort on understanding other states, their interests and ambitions, and on searching for non-violent approaches to differences. The human defense genes are easily triggered, while demands for diplomacy, dialogue, and détente are likely to be branded as meek. To read the sometimes shifting intentions of foreign regimes may also be more difficult than conjecturing possible actions from the size, position, character, and location of their armed forces. It requires much knowledge, experience, intelligence, and in addition, I would say, empathy. Sometimes when armistices are reached after years of fighting, we hear it said that the conflict had no solution, no armed solution. We cannot help but wonder if that reflection could not have come earlier and led to a solution by diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Blix, for those remarks. We will turn now to a discussion and questions from the audience. I would ask, if you do have a question for Dr. Blix, can you please use the raise hand function on Zoom? And if I might take the opportunity as chair, I might pose an initial question to you, Dr. Blix. You mentioned the need for new rules to constrain the types of hybrid warfare that you envisage as playing a possibly major role in the future. And I'd ask if you might be able to describe what you view these new rules, what might these new rules look like, and how can they be achieved with the impasses that currently exist within the Security Council?
Well, we are familiar with the laws of war, but the more armed action are likely, as I suggest, to be substituted by more subversive means, and they are usually hit by the rules against intervention. In the International Court of Justice discussed the question in the Nicaragua versus U.S. case, and it's stated it was evidently U.S., for instance, mined waters outside Managua. Now that was clearly a use of force. On the other hand, giving money to Salvadorians or people who would act in Nicaragua to weaken the regime, that perhaps was not so evidently against the UN Charter Article 2, Paragraph 4, but it might have been against the rule of intervention. And similarly, you have the use of the cyber means of influencing elections. Are they illegal or are they not? They may be illegal under national law, but are they illegal under international law? That is not so clear. And I think the rules against intervention have not been codified as clearly as the rules of war. They were codified already 1899 in the Hague Conventions. And you have a long declaration adopted by the General Assembly about intervention, but that was not adopted by unanimity. So there's a good deal of different opinions on what is permitted or not. Or take a case like the Israeli and the reported action of Israel and US to take the Stuxnet, whereby they damaged centrifuges in Iran, centrifuges for enrichment. Now, that was clearly an intervention, and exactly how it will be judged by an international court, I'm not sure. So I think that there will be a big scope for trying to define what is permissible and what is not permissible. We will want to keep the public influence of public opinion free. And actually, Russia and Soviet Union, after the Second World War, their effort to influence and to expand in Europe was more by public opinion and by the big communist parties in France and in Italy, rather than by military force. I mean, the West sort of geared up to protect themselves through NATO against a military invasion, but the bigger danger was probably through this use of public opinion. Now, the West was successful in countering that merely by building up its societies in a democratic way and being reasonably successful economically. And I think that still remains the asset for the Western world, that the liberal democracies of Europe, that they work. You can, for instance, have a change of government without force. That's a big thing. And they also work reasonably well economically, perhaps not quite as fast as the US or China, but anyway, reasonably well. And that makes it attractive. And I think that's a very good defense against Soviet efforts to infiltrate and to affect public opinion by cyber.
Thank you very much. Just by going in the order in which hands have appeared on my screen, I will hand the mic to Paul Ingram, if you'd like to go ahead with your question, please.
Thank you. And good to see you again, Hans. Glad to see that you're still very actively involved in this thinking. It's very encouraging. I've got two questions I'll sneak in. The first is just this morning I was reviewing a number of publications by Chris Ford. You may remember him, Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation under the first Trump administration. He's a Mandarin speaker, expert in Chinese, practicing Buddhist, but very much of the opinion that war with China is inevitable, and that China is on a course to attempt to dominate the world. And so my question is, when you have people like that who are in positions of decision-making influence, who really take a worst-case scenario interpretation of adversaries, what hope is there that we escape this a trap that we have, that the only way to exist in this world as a great power is to dominate or be dominated? My second question is possibly a suggestion as an answer, but the question is, I'm very interested in your hybrid warfare observations. One area that I think is particularly pertinent on today, Liberation Day, where in 6 hours' time we will hear President Trump outlining his his extraordinary opinions on how the world should be organized economically, whether there's an opportunity here to use economic, not warfare, but economic relationships, so that as we bring economies closer together and integrate them more, so we're coupling them in more and more ways, it becomes more and more expensive to engage in any type of conflict, but it also opens up the possibility for a form of economic deterrence, which is not the form that President Trump is currently about to inflict on the world, but rather a message to those states that are, for want of a better word, delinquent, that they could be brought down by economic tools.
All right. Well, on China, it strikes me that we talk about the Russia being aggressive and expansionist, and it's many people in Europe assume that if Putin has his way and gets 20% of Ukrainian territory, then he will inevitably push on to Poland, Czechoslovakia. I don't see that happen. That's why I characterize the Russian actions as a policy of containment in reverse. That doesn't excuse the aggression, which was clearly a violation of the UN Charter. But you talked about China, and it's also one talks about China has been an aggressive policy. Well, China has not expanded very much. It took Tibet at the end of the Second World War, and it is remarkable that it's the US that has expanded over the Pacific. The two islands, Quemoy and Matsu, are just within eyesight from the Chinese mainland. So I think it's a little misleading to characterize. Big danger is that China would expand and be aggressive in the Pacific. In the South China Sea, it's clear that they are up to rather naughty activities and deciding, and they lost the case in a permanent court of arbitration about the sovereignty over the islands. So they have constructed islands. Now, I don't defend what they have done, but I don't think that it is this very big scale. The Taiwan issue is the bigger, and it is not, as I said, a hunger for land. It is rather a question of pride, that they feel that it's still evidence of how the world treated China in the past. The Taiwan issue reached a solution during the Nixon era in saying that no one will act in it. The West will not recognize China's sovereignty over Taiwan, and China will not use any forceful means to liberate it. And we hope that that can stay. It's a little wobbly, I admit, and many people are saying that, look, the Chinese will watch what happens in the Ukraine. If Putin can get away with keeping Crimea, then perhaps he will encourage the Chinese to grab Taiwan. On the other hand, I think that the Chinese seem intent to go for a multilateral order, a multipolar and multilateral order. They are very dependent upon trade, much more so than the Russians was ever. And I don't think that's something one should regret. I think one should rather encourage them to stick and honestly respect the rules of the international commerce. And they may not always have done so and on industrial property and so forth. That's quite possible. But I somehow feel that while they still have a chip on their shoulder for the past, nevertheless, they are very, very more prudent in thinking. It occurs to me that the story about Hammarskjöld meeting Zhou Enlai, and Hammarskjöld asked Zhou Enlai, what impact did the French Revolution have of China? And Zhou Enlai answered that it's too early to decide. Well, I think that attitude of prudence is welcome, and I think that the Chinese leadership, in a way, is less peculiar than both the American and the Russian leadership are. So I'm mildly optimistic, but I don't deny that there are risks particularly in South China Sea. And in my view, the solution might lie in a close study of the law of the sea, because the American objection is really that the Chinese stop trade and transit, that so much goods go through that maritime area. And I think that in a calmer climate, one could try to trace a solution to the South China Sea at any rate. Now, that was your first question. The second was about hybrid war, and I think that, of course, ever since the Napoleonic Wars, economics and blockades has been a existing means of pressure. And today, with the world being so closely tied together economically, it is easy to hurt each other. And we see it right now today, in the so-called Day of Liberation. But if you take the case of Iran, it is evident. I mean, the U.S. thought that breaking the JCPO agreement about Iran's restraining their nuclear development, that U.S. could pressure Iran to do exactly what we don't know. Maybe it would be to restrain the Hezbollah and the Houthis, but that's not in any way. Trump wanted to hurt Iran, and he breached the unanimous Security Council resolution. And not only did he start U.S. sanctions against Iran, he also forced European enterprises to apply and to abide by U.S. sanctions, although the Europeans were willing to go by the agreement that Security Council had sanctioned. So the sanctions, how effective are they? That's debated by many, but that they have some effect, it's clear. I mean, Putin is very eager to have sanctions lifted, and there is much discussion about that. The U.S. may be contemplated doing that, but the Europeans do not seem to be inclined to do it. So I think economic and financial warfare, this permission to participate in Swish, this has today much greater potency than in the past.
Thank you very much, Hans. I see a question in the chat from Carlo Treza, although you have your hand raised as well. I might first come to your question that you posed in the chat, and then I will ask following that Alan Ware to pose your question. On Carlo's question, Carlo Treza, could you comment on the decision by Nordic and Baltic states bordering Russia to withdraw from the mine ban treaty?
From which treaty?
From the mine ban treaty.
Aha. Well, the Finns have begun, I think, such a retreat from the treaty, and it has also been earlier heard from South Koreans that they feel that they are eminent in defensive position, that mines are a defensive tool. I think that's true, and I regret it happened there. I have some understanding for the Finns. Now, having said that, I think that the Finnish reaction right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Swedish following that has been understandable, but unfortunate. It's understandable because ordinary people, not the governments, but ordinary people say that if Russia can attack Ukraine, then it can attack us. And the Finns have a terrible experience of that, which we have not had in Sweden. But I think that this is a misunderstanding of the Putin's intentions. As I explained, I think that he had hoped for he and the leadership in Moscow regards the government as a resulting from a coup, and they had a misunderstanding of the public opinion in Ukraine. I don't see any signs that Putin or Russia would intend to go beyond Ukraine. It probably had intention and hoping that the whole country, the regime would collapse. It didn't do that, and therefore the operation was a total failure from the point of view of Russia. It may succeed in moving NATO away from Russia, from borders, but instead it got Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and they have lost hundreds of thousands of people. So I think it was a stunning failure from the Russian point of view. Now, you're getting back to the mines. I think that I'm fairly optimistic that there will be first a ceasefire and then an armistice. And in any case, even so, the armistice, in my guess and many others, will be a loss of 20% of territory for Ukraine. That is a loss also, a very serious loss of authority of the UN Charter, because it goes against the rule-based international law enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter. The Russians were not alone on that. The war in Iraq, 2003, was another one. Turkish incursions into Syria, and the Israeli incursions into an annexation of the Golan Heights. There are many encroachments on that, but that will be effect of the Russian action in the Ukraine. But I don't see that it goes beyond that, and therefore I would also hope that the Finns and others will come back to the anti-personnel mine. I took part myself in Geneva in the 70s in the convention drawing up the revision of the laws of war, and we discussed very much the teabag-sized mines that Americans spread in Vietnam, and which have been very injurious for civilian populations ever after the wars. So we have very good reasons to the world to get rid of that mine, that kind of weapon.
Okay. I will hand the microphone next over to Alan Ware. Alan, if you'd like to come off mute, please, your question.
Thank you very much, James. Hello, Dr. Blix. Alan Ware, Program Director for the World Federalist Movement. You've mentioned a number of times rules of law and the International Court of Justice. So my question is whether the International Court of Justice could be better used to help resolve particularly territorial conflicts, but also other conflicts to prevent them escalating into armed conflict, or even to help in peace processes to end armed conflict. And I point, for example, to Chad versus Libya, which ended a decade of armed conflict between those two countries over the territorial dispute, and Costa Rica versus Nicaragua, which helped Nicaragua remove its occupation of the islands in San Juan. And in both of those cases, I think the court explored a lot of the historical background to the conflicts as well as the law. So could it be used better and possibly even to help bring in a ceasefire in the Russia versus Ukraine conflict?
Well, I wish it could, but I'm not optimistic. One needs other measures and weapons to solve the conflicts, but and negotiations, diplomacy have always been, even in early European times, the conciliation of parties have a mediation functions, and we see in the 19th century a movement for more arbitration. But they were not major conflicts that were solved in that way. And similarly, under the International Court of Justice, there's not been major conflicts that they have solved. They have been very useful in when countries have had conflicts about territorial waters or islands, but they have not been life and death conflicts, and usually not very huge areas. An exception perhaps was in the 30s when the Denmark and Norway quarreled about the sovereignty over eastern Greenland. Then the court decided in favor of Denmark, and eastern Greenland, like the rest of the Greenland, fell into Danish sovereignty. Today, I think the court's advisory opinions have been useful, especially the one about the nuclear weapons, permissibility of nuclear weapons, but also other cases. This is where the General Assembly turns to the court and asks for an advisory opinion. There is weight in what the court says and does, and so it adds to public opinion in the world. But I doubt that the US or Russia or Ukraine would submit the the war into the court for decision. I think that diplomacy is the way, and I think that's very badly underestimated. We tend to have our opinion about rather firm opinions about the parties, and that colors very much the readiness to have any settlement. I think that with all the amazement one might have before Trump's suggestions about Greenland or about Panama or Canada, etc. I think nevertheless that the US being more further away from Europe perhaps saw that while Russia permitted impermissible and illegal aggression, nevertheless defeating Russia and throwing them out of the Ukraine was very unlikely, that the US would not continue to support with as big sums as they did, and certainly not send any weapons, any troops on the ground, that the Europeans would also not send any troops on the ground, and that therefore there was not a winning fight for the Ukraine to recover their territories. There was rather a risk that they might lose more in a war of attrition. So in that sense, I think that Trump had a more realistic viewpoint than we would wish. We had more of a wishful thinking. And I think that this was one point. The other was that Trump realized that NATO membership for Ukraine in the future could not bring peace. He said, and I think in a moment of understanding how things are, that he understood that Russia did not like to have NATO troops on its threshold, on its borders. So that I think that for Trump, in this sense, much though I disagree and dislike much of what he does, I think that he brought an element of realism and back to diplomacy. I don't think he would never go to a court on international court, and he has no real regard for international law. He feels that he probably wants to establish peace, but he has no regard for law. And then I think that he will not very happily enter into agreements and bind himself. He wants the US to be powerful and free to order.
Thank you. In the interest of timekeeping, we have approximately 15 minutes remaining. We can take two questions at this point. So I'll first turn to Yuri and then second to Mohammed. Yuri, if you could please go ahead with your question.
Yuri Shelezhenko, Ukrainian Pacifist Movement. Thank you for your presentation and wish As you rightly pointed out, despite existing soft methods of nonviolent conflict resolution, military deterrence and warfare is prevailing. There are movements, campaigns in societies to educate people for peaceful conflict resolution, resistance, and nonviolent change. But these movements and campaigns are either instrumentalized for military purposes or repressed as threats to national security. It seems that the structural violence is self-sustaining and prevent any significant nonviolent changes towards a world free from the scourge of war. And the states and corporations promoting militarism are main sponsors of science and media that shift popular opinion, politics and economy towards militarism. Do you see any possibility of emancipation of knowledge-based public discourse from prevailing militarism, making scientific knowledge to serve peace and non-violent enforcement of international law? There was another question in chat about peace through law project. A mobilization of academics community for structural
Yuri,
changes.
If I could ask, if you could just pose your question, please. Just to make sure that we can get round to everyone. Thank you.
Yes, my question is whether you see this possibility of emancipation of public discourse from prevailing militarism based on scientific knowledge, mobilization of academic community for structural changes towards a better world civil society based on peaceful social norms where everybody refuses to kill and therefore the war is abolished.
Well, yes, I sympathize with your question, but I think that more time will be needed. I mentioned that in the 19th century, the movement began for a greater use of arbitration. That was in the middle of the 19th century. Then there came the Hague Convention in 1899, which set up a permanent court of justice. And in 1920, you got the League of Nations. And the first legal ban on the use of force, it was violated by Italy and by Japan and by Germany. And then you had the Second World War. And after that, you had the Nuremberg tribunals that inflicted personal responsibility. And you had the United Nations and the UN Charter. And you also actually have some implementation of the legal personal responsibility. So things are changing. That's why I said at the beginning of my statement that it is very wrong to say that there's always been war and there always will be war. And I think that the central factor there is public opinion. It was in the 19th century and it was after the Second World War. And it remains now, but it is slow. And it has not I think the legal verdicts of that comes of the General Assembly condemns one intervention or another, that this is valuable and it moves us forward. We can only hope that we will survive, that we will not be wiped out by global warming before we're successful.
Indeed. Mohammed, please, your question.
Great to see you, Hans.
Hello, Mohammed.
How are you?
Well, I'm aging, but I'm still alive.
We both are, but it's great to see, with your mind as sharp as ever. However, for the sake of time, I would like to mention that in the last couple of years, I see that we're going backward, frankly, on the big picture. One, I never seen such disdain for the rule of law as we have seen lately.
Wow.
Public opinion now, particularly in the global south and in the north, that if you really want to have peace, you have to have nuclear weapons, which is something obviously horrible. And that question is being raised both at the governmental level and at the people level. Everywhere I see, people think if you really want to have national security, you first have to have a nuclear deterrence and then use your diplomacy or whatever. And the feeling among young people, which I see always, that they don't really believe that international law is there any longer. It just the powerful who have nuclear weapons can dictate what they are doing. And of course, Mr. Trump is not helping every day. So do you see that we will be able to save the nuclear system, nuclear non-proliferation, where we spent most of our life working on it? And do you see that we will be able to restore confidence or trust in international legal system?
Well, I mean, you are a little more pessimistic than I am.
I usually am, yes.
I know that. And I admit that Trump is a very uncertain factor in this. If he says that he will take away the nuclear umbrella from South Korea, from Japan, he will stimulate thoughts of South Korea getting a nuclear weapon of their own. And there are also people in Japan, not many, but some. And you have the same thing if Trump and Israel continues to push Iran.
Correct.
Well, then there will be an Iranian weapon. And if Iran has, you may have one in Turkey, and you may have one in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt. So, and I even seen a Swedish newspaper, someone saying that we have now no American umbrella, so we may need to have nuclear weapons. Well, I'm still optimistic, and I think that even Trump will discover that this is not a very good idea to have further states with nuclear weapons, and the military will certainly understand that. And in Europe, they will be leading Macron and others to see whether they will have a common European umbrella, or that the French will hold it out. I think the stocks of nuclear weapons are incredibly exaggerated, and as I said, it's the second strike capacity that really means something. You don't need 1,550 strategic weapons for second strike. Maybe you can do away with 50. That's a long way to descend. And earlier I had hope, optimism that after the end of Ukraine war and the end in the Middle East, that there would be a sort of sigh of relief, just as after the Cuban affair, 1962, when we got the partial test ban and NPT. With Trump, it's more unpredictable, I think. But it takes it. One needs to study the man. I think that he, as I said, he has no regard at all for law or for agreements, none whatever. At the same time, and he has a lot of narcissism, yes. But at the same time, he wants to be an apostle of peace. He wants to be loved by public opinion, and public opinion does not love boots on the ground. And so he says, I can create peace in 24 hours in the Ukraine. And I think that he loves threats, but I don't think he loves war. He would like to, like you, have to have a Nobel Prize. I don't think he would deserve it as well. But I think maybe he wants to be canonized one day too. I don't know, possibly. But that gives me some hope that he will stop not really using the wars. Now that's a optimistic guess, and you may be. I hope you will not be more right than I am, Mohammed.
I hope I'm wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just, in terms of the questions, the order in which they arrived, I have one in the chat from Jen Parkhouse, and then Paul, I will turn to you. The question from Jen Parkhouse, and we're just coming up on almost on closing time. During the Biden administration, a decision was made for American nuclear weapons to return to Lakenheath. In response to that, the Lakenheath Alliance has been formed. The question is President Trump likely to go ahead with their return, the nuclear weapons to Lakenheath, the base in the United Kingdom? Your view, Hans?
would Trump be likely to
return the nuclear weapons to Lakenheath, is my understanding of the question that Jen has posed.
Well, we see no signs of restraint in developing the nuclear weapons. They have plans for a vast revamping of the whole nuclear structure, and they have retained the triad. That's to say, the submarines and the airplanes and ICBM missiles from the ground, and it's a fantastic cost for the next 30 years. But at the same time, Trump says that he is optimistic about the reduction of nuclear weapons. There are far too many, and I think he has the economic instincts that is very wasteful. He talks also about the possibility of halving military budgets. Well, that's a good instinct. I think one of the miracles or peculiarities, I think, is that taxpayers have not revolted more in the military build-up. Eisenhower was right in warning the United States about a military-industrial complex, and it's a huge colossus in the United States and influential on members of the U.S. Congress. Now, Trump clearly has seen that it costs a lot of money to have nuclear weapons and the build-up, and maybe we'll have to see whether he will be willing to sit down with Putin and with Xi to move towards disarmament. But if so, then he will also have to move more into diplomacy and to concessions.
We can go next to Paul.
Sorry.
Hello again, Dr. Blix. Nice to talk again. My question really is about our historical epoch and whether it means the end of multilateral agreements and multilateral adjudication. The world seems split entirely on particularly Ukraine, but it's a number of other issues, into different blocs who vote differently over the most obviously glaring, evident matters like invasion and everything behind that. Is it ever do you see anything which is going to enable the multilateral diplomacy and arms control that you and I both remember to become realistic again? Doesn't there have to be some kind of unforeseeable settlement between major powers before that can be an imaginable prospect for international affairs again?
Well, before Trump came to power, I had hoped that as after the Cuban affair in '62, the shock and relief after Ukrainian would bring them together, and that there would be discovered between the US and Russia and China that they have some very big joint interest actually. And the first, I think, would be the environmental, the climate question. The second, I think, would be the combating of international criminality, say the narcotics trade. And the third was the pandemics. Now, these were three relatively innocent areas where the differences were not very great in substance. However, with Trump in power, I'm not sure that that's going to be so easy to get. He has a disdain for multilateralism, and it clearly also doesn't consider at all the rules of the UN Charter. He is very happily to disregard them. What gives me hope is we are drifting, or have been drifting, towards a polarization with the Western bloc, and expanded also with Sweden and Finland in NATO, and the Russia-China building together, perhaps with North Vietnam, and maybe some support by Iran, and then the South. But I think that the South, and in particular with Brazil and the BRIC, is important. The Russians say that their orthodox culture and the morals will prevail over the decadent West. And I think that's a fantasy. I think that the Western liberal democracy has a great deal of attraction. We should not be presumptuous and smug about it. But I think that merely by practicing this liberal democracy that we have in Europe is an example that is attractive for not only for Ukrainians, but many others. And I think that when Russia turns to the south and China turns around and they build the brick, they will not have their extreme views prevail. I think the South is resentful of much that the West has done, but it has a rightful claim to be more heard and represented than it has been in the past. And I think that will be a moderating influence on the Chinese and on the Russians. They cannot simply just say demand and clash with the West. So I think I look with some hope for a multipolar world in which the West, in which more voice will be given to the South. If you look at the rules of voting in the World Bank and in the IMF, for instance, then I think that it's not only fair, but it will also be, I think, very in a collective self-interest that we have a more multilateralist world.
Thank you. Remarkably optimistic.
Thank you very much.
I try to.
On that note, I think we are just drawing up on time for this afternoon's session. I'd once again, on behalf of British Pugwash, like to thank Dr. Blix for taking your time this afternoon to share your thoughts with our members and our wider community. I'd very much like to thank everyone who attended today's session, and I'd like to thank everyone who posed a question as well during today's session. I'm going to post a link to Dr. Blix's book, recently published by OUP, in the chat, and would like to invite everybody who has attended to stay connected with British Pugwash. If you are not already a member, please do join the organization, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next session. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Blix, and best wishes to everyone who has joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you.